This gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There seems to be a great deal of confusion as to the purpose of this hearing, which is supposed to be about this current administration, the White House narrative on the Iran nuclear deal. In Mr. Samuel's article, Leon Panetta stated that he, during his tenure as director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense, never saw the letters that Obama covertly sent to Iran's supreme leader in 2009 and 2012. He goes on to say that he would like to believe that Tom Donilon, then National Security Advisor, and Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, had a chance to work on the offer they presented. Mr. Duran, let me begin with you. Is there any information confirming that Mr. Donilon or Secretary Clinton worked on those letters?
None that I know of.
Okay. Mr. Rubin, is the circumventing, let's use that word, of relevant department and agency heads in major foreign policy decisions typical behavior for members of the National Security Council and other White House staffers?
It has become a problem that has grown with time, dating back administrations.
So this is common practice these days?
This has become all too common, yes.
Mr. Hanna?
I do think something has changed in that regard. Just the fact that we have a Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications whose job is both to help develop policy, it seems, as closest foreign policy aide to the president, and the guy who is selling it, I think is worrisome. I've got to say that in our administration, you can maybe fault us for a lot, but the fact is that people like Karl Rove, who is in charge of our communications, never sat in National Security Council meetings. There was a pretty strict divide between those two.
Mr. Rubin, back to you. How much undue influence do you believe that these staffers have over national security policy?
As Mr. Hanna said, I believe that this administration has blurred a line that has existed over previous administrations, both Democratic and Republican.
Okay, Mr. Hanna, you mentioned in your testimony earlier that with one bold move, the administration effectively made a radical shift in American foreign policy. Is that a correct assessment of your opinion?
Yes, it certainly is. Yeah.
Okay, the question then comes down to who ultimately is responsible for that shift in foreign policy. Would you say it's Ben Rhodes, other staffers, or the president himself?
No, the policy toward Iran and toward the general retrenchment from the Middle East seems clearly to be President Obama's. He's in charge of that policy.
Okay, and yet there is some influencers, appears to be in his life. Ben Rhodes, as referred to earlier, is recognized as the single most influential voice on foreign policy to the president. So what kind of role did he have in shaping this radical shift?
I don't know, and I do want to have the caveat that this is the shift presented by the policy, although I think it is consistent, as Mr. Duran has said, with the general thrust of the administration's policy toward Iran and toward the Middle East since 2008. I just don't think it's been presented that way. They want to remove and distance themselves from our closest allies in the Middle East, including Israel. And what they tell our allies and they tell the American people is that their relationship is stronger than ever and they will forever have Israel's back. And that's just defied by what's presented in the article. And it's that contradiction that worries me so much about what is really going on. Are we having a full and open debate about what we want to do? You've got to hand it to Mr. Trump. At least he says, I want to get out of this place. It's too expensive. It's too costly. Our allies are too much trouble. I want to distance ourselves from it.
So let me clarify what you're saying, because it's troubling to me as well, extremely troubling, that the American people, that Congress, that our allies, when there is such a radical shift of the magnitude of this type of foreign policy, that the American people, Congress, and our allies are not aware of it. So the only way, do you believe the American people and Congress would support a shift that major had they known about it?
No, I think as Mr. Durant said, and Secretary Panetta is in fact quoted in the piece as saying if they'd done that, they'd have gotten the blank kicked out of them.
Absolutely. So the only way to pull this over the American people's eyes and Congress and our allies is by spinning the truth. and make people get on board something that is not indeed
That is
reality.
the extremely strong suggestion of the article, that you had to spin it
But
because
yes,
you did.
no, then right down the line, would you agree with that assessment?
Yes.
I'll yield.
Yes.
And Mr. Hanna?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields back now.